In this last video, we're going to be looking at what's meant by structural reforms and microeconomic reform policy. So we've looked at budgetary policy, supply-side initiatives, industry policy, and now we're going to look at structural reforms and microeconomic reform policy. In relation to industry assistance and industry policy, the definition of this, and I should have talked about this in the last video, but basically it's any government assistance to industry that will help the person or business to undertake some form of business activity. So that can typically take the form of subsidies for businesses. It can also include tariffs or quotas to protect them against imports, tax concessions for investing in certain areas which will help them to pay less tax and make them more competitive, or the provision of government services at discounted rates, so the government helping out these industries at lower rates, or the government policies that will favour domestic businesses against foreign competitors. So any policy designed to give preferential treatment to Australian businesses as well. So government assistance to industries can include subsidies, tariffs, quotas, any form of tax concessions for businesses, or any services that they're providing to businesses at discounted rates, or any favouritism that they're providing in terms of government help or assistance. Structural reforms are not that important to this chapter, and they're not an example of supply-side policies because they've got absolutely nothing to do with what the government's doing. So structural reforms are very different, and it's just basically a business deciding to change the way they operate. So, for example, if there's a threat of cheaper imports because perhaps of some form of change to trade liberalisation in the past, which is a form of microeconomic reform policy, if the business just decides to change the way that they go about doing things, that's an example of structural reform. So normal competitive pressures cause businesses to review their operations and try and improve performance. So, for example, if Kodak decided to move some of its operations offshore, or Bloodstone decided to move offshore, or something like that, or outsource part of some of their divisions, or get rid of a lot of the middle management. So rather than having like a very vertical structure where you've got a lot of senior managers and less senior managers, or middle management, and then sort of your general workers, they can decentralise their operations and just have a few bosses and a more sort of horizontal approach where you've got a lot of people just working under one boss. So they're all examples of structural reforms where the business just updates or changes the way they go about doing things, which has nothing to do with the government policies, or is not an example of an actual government policy to change how they go about doing things. Then we have microeconomic reform policies. So we've got assistance to businesses, then we've got businesses just changing the way they do things themselves. Microeconomic reform policy are specific aggregate supply policies that seek to improve the structure and operation of markets in an effort to achieve a more efficient allocation of resources. So this isn't necessarily referring to assistance to businesses, so we're not talking about subsidies here and things like that, but they're ways that the government goes about making particular sectors of the economy more efficient. So this is where you're sort of talking about things like trade liberalisation and labour market reforms and decentralisation or deregulation of the labour market, because all of the idea behind all of these is to try and make businesses more competitive and more productive, because they're exposing them to more competition, they're tying wages back into how productive people are being. So microeconomic reforms are micro in nature, which basically means they focus on particular sectors of the economy, and helping to reduce the cost within that particular industry. So we're not talking about changes to business taxes or infrastructure spending here. We're talking about reforms to particular industries with the idea of achieving a more efficient allocation of resources. So a lot of these reform policies are focused on removing barriers to businesses becoming more efficient. And that barrier may be high tariffs. And the idea is that the economy is better utilising its resources and creating an environment that's more conducive to productivity and productive investment. So microeconomic reform policies are aimed at improving the efficiency and therefore the competitiveness of industries. If industries become more efficient, per unit production costs will be lower and therefore they'll make more profits and firms will be more willing and able to produce. So anything that's trying to promote the efficiency of businesses, not necessarily cash assistance, but other ways to try and increase productivity or increase competition are examples of microeconomic reform policies. They may encourage producers to move resources into those efficient industries, moving away from industries that were not using resources efficiently. So trade liberalisation tries to shift resources to areas of comparative advantage by minimising tariffs on exports. So examples of microeconomic reform policies. Again, microeconomic reform policies aims to make our industries more flexible and responsive to changing economic circumstances, and in a sense making us more technical, dynamic and intertemporally efficient. So that includes labour market reforms, so things like getting rid of unfair dismissal laws, individual contracts, so people get paid based on their level of productivity, trade liberalisation, so removing tariffs and quotas and all these kinds of things, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter. Deregulation, so getting rid of government intervention within markets, so freeing them up to the private sector. And another thing called national competition policy, which was all about trying to promote competition within particular industries. You don't need to know any of the details of this one, or even this one, but we're going to study trade liberalisation. So, to sum up what we've talked about throughout this chapter, and we explore microeconomic reform policies more in the next chapter, but budgetary supply side policies, policies within the budget that generally refer to boosting productivity, population or participation, and that includes all your changes to taxes and infrastructure spending. Then you've got industry policy, which is assistance given to businesses, and in the last 30 to 40 years, that's shifted away from protecting industries to providing assistance to industries that will promote positive externalities and benefits for the society as a whole. Then we have microeconomic reform policies, which are policies designed to boost competitiveness and efficiency. They're not always popular. They often hurt low-income earners that have less bargaining power, and they're not direct assistance for businesses. They're not examples of subsidies or tax concessions. That belongs in this category. These are more related to ideas to make businesses more productive and more efficient going forward. And the last one is structural change, which is all about businesses implementing their own reforms to become more productive. So this one is not a supply-side policy. It doesn't involve the government. It's just the businesses acting in their own accord. Businesses acting on their own accord, the first one. This one about policies to boost efficiency. This one's about providing assistance. And these ones about what we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks in relation to what we can do through the budget. Thank you.